meet up with local photographer and historian Bob Caddick.
We're in a little hamlet called Ringstead, and a place that you could actually drive by without noticing. It's a very quiet little hamlet, and it's just starting to snow, Helen. It's really quite exciting, isn't it? We're standing here in the snow in a little village in Northamptonshire, but the sun is shining. We're here at the Axe and Compass, which is the village pub. It's about all there is really in Ringstead, and 100 odd years ago this was the scene of some quite dramatic events. Not the pub itself, but Ringstead village. We have to look back a little earlier than 100 years ago and realise why Northamptonshire became the centre of the boot and shoe industry. And it was because of the location and the woodland and the river and the abundance of wild livestock for leather. So much so that all of the English and British armies from about the 16th century marched on Northamptonshire leather. You would have found the boots being worn by the Civil War soldiers, the French Napoleonic War soldiers, the American Civil War soldiers, and later on through history. And the one particular conflict that we're interested in was the Boer War. The Boer War was obviously in South Africa, and it was a bitter conflict between the British and the Boers, who were Dutch settlers. They were farmsteaders, but they felt that they had cleared the land, therefore it was their land. And of course our empirical attitude was that no, it's ours. Of course, right in the middle of all of this territory was the Kimberley mines, full of diamonds, which, as we still know today, Amsterdam is one of the centres of the diamond industry. So it was a very strategically important conflict, and a very bitter one. The term concentration camps originated in the Boer War, set up by the British to imprison people. And we're digressing a little bit from Northamptonshire boot and shoe, but it gives it a context. This war had dragged on, and in fact people refer to the Boer War. There were two wars. It was the Second War that was particularly unpleasant. That ended in 1902. And during that long period of empire expansion, the boot and shoe makers of Northamptonshire enjoyed a lot of business and a lot of government contracts for the military. With the end of the Second Boer War, we entered a period of sort of relative stability, and the contracts became fewer and fewer. And in a sort of strange echo of the Carillion situation today, the factories that had the contracts found themselves not making enough money because they had undercut. They had priced to get the business. And when, I suppose, some accountant back in 1905 looked and said, "Hey, boss, we're not doing very well on this," they had one recourse in those days, which was to cut the wages. It didn't apply to the civilian boot and shoe makers, but it applied to the companies that specialised in military footwear. And most of those were around Raunds and the area. We're in Ringstead because most of the workers at these factories didn't actually go to the factory and work all day. They would go into the factory, pick up their work, and come home. They were out workers. And the rate for the per shoe was dramatically cut by 50 or 60% in some cases, which meant that if you were a worker in the military area of shoemaking, you were suddenly on the breadline. Even though you were working, your weekly pay had been cut so severely. The boot and shoemakers union decided to do something about this, and they took a levy from the workers who were doing okay and guaranteed that the people in this particular area, Raunds and Ringstead, who were working on military contracts, would get 5 shillings a week strike pay and a 15 shilling a week payment when they were working to help with their family income. This meant that the men and women working on these contracts had at least some financial security, and decided that they could challenge the factory owners. So a strike was called in the beginning of early March 1905. By the middle of March 1905, a week or so later, 500 workers were out on strike. Many of them in Raunds, but a substantial number here in Ringstead. The demand was that they should be merely paid the agreed rate that was part of the contract, and that the contract should stand. And the factory owners were saying, well, obviously we're not going to do that. After a couple of weeks of strike with fairly easy relations between everyone, a number of people decided to try breaking the strike. They wanted to work. They needed at least that extra little bit of money. And one of those was a fellow called George Roberts from Ringstead. George Roberts decided that he was going into work. He would cycle every day up to Raunds, pick up his piecework, pick up his stuff on his bike, ride back into Ringstead and work. After this became known, mobs would gather outside his house. They would chant that he was a blackleg and the scab and all of the usual sort of picketing tactics. At one point it became so bad that at least 10 police officers and civilian supporters came to help protect the house. The windows were put in, and I think most worrying and most soul-destroying was the process called tinning, where everyone from the village would come out with their tin kettles, and bang, 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 as they came in and out of the house, just a huge cacophony of noise and yelling. You can only imagine it was, if you think back a few years back, maybe more than a few, to some of the big pickets that happened in London and the miners' strike, where people were really intimidated by a mob. In this little village that we're standing in here now, that is so quiet, we can hear the bird song. It must have been quite an event. Mm-hmm. Roberts carried on with intimidation, and it got to later in the month, and Thrapston magistrates held a special sessions to deal with this intimidation. They had 17 strikers in front of them. One of whom had been heard and was reported to say, "You'll not get back home tonight, George. You're going to meet somebody on the road." A clear threat. Mm. Time passed another week or so, and of course, hungry bellies then started to make their effect known, and people were drifting back to work and accepting that they were on lower pay. The union wasn't finished. The local organiser was a man named James Gribble, and he had served in the army. He was only a serving soldier. He wasn't an officer, but he decided unilaterally, hadn't got union backing from anyone, that they were going to march to London. Now, later in history, we're familiar with people marching to London, and there had been marches before, but very small scale, and not organised in any way. And he just decided that he was going to get a number of men to march up to London. 300 men volunteered. He picked 115 who he felt could actually make the journey. It wasn't they weren't going on the train; they were going to walk. And so they set off to march to London. A huge undertaking, if you think about it. Happily, they had good boots. they had probably the pick of the boots to go and march in. They gathered support all of along the way, and it took them about 3 days to march there, and stayed overnight, and people volunteered their spare rooms and beds. The national newspapers picked up on this, and by the time they arrived in Hyde Park, there was a crowd of about 10,000 people waiting to welcome them and greet them and support them. I think there was a feeling that natural justice had not been done. They had done their job, they had agreed a rate, and the rate had been cut. After a brief rally and respite, Gribble and a few people went to the House of Commons, and they managed to get into the Strangers. They didn't force their way, but they went into the Strangers Gallery, where a debate on suffrage was going on. Another topic of the day, the right of women to vote. And Mr. Gribble and his men sat and listened, and there was obviously some kind of, I think it's called filibuster debate going on. And Gribble stood up and said in a very loud voice, "I listen. Is this man trying to talk us out of time? I don't know about what this is all about, but I've come here with 115 men from Northamptonshire. We want to talk about our jobs." And of course, he was ejected rather rapidly. He was shown the door. But he'd made his point. Before that day was out, a solicitor had been appointed by the government to look into the contract and decide whether their claims were valid or what had been going on. He stayed in London a couple of days, and a further rally was held in Trafalgar Square this time. And Keir Hardie, the great Labour Party chairman and figurehead of socialism, I suppose, in growing socialism, spoke on their behalf, which carried a huge amount of weight. They marched back up to Raunds and Ringstead. They didn't take the train, they walked back. It took them a few days longer to come back. Maybe they stopped and imbibed on the way, who knows. But they came back to a rapturous welcome, both in Raunds and here in tiny Ringstead. Within a matter of weeks, the government had agreed that their payments should be reinstated. And within a year of that, a statute was passed that government contracts should be honoured. And it was a major trades union victory. And it proved and I suppose generated the idea that you should take your cause to the top, take to the streets, if you like, and just say that we're not going to have enough. And so the man who we talked about earlier, George Roberts, became known as the Ringstead blackleg, and we wonder what became of him. He was described by his own nephew some years later as a narrow-minded bigot, which wasn't the most friendly thing you could say. He was not universally liked. He had fallen out with his neighbours. His family, and we're going to come to them shortly, his family, the Robertses, in this village, were nonconformist teetotalers. He liked to drink, not to say he was an excessive drinker, but he came perhaps to the Axe and Compass and had a couple of pints, and he went to, let's say, the regular church. So he was a nonconformist. He decided he was going to go his own way. And what became of him? Well, history doesn't tell us much more than that, but his niece became rather well known, or his great niece, Margaret Hilda Roberts. And maybe some of that lady's views about trades unionism and other matters filtered down through the generations. If you come to the Axe and Compasses, the landlord here is actually putting together a small selection of old photographs of the village and village life, and he's actually got some quite nice little artefacts which you might like to peruse over your pint and think about 100 years ago when this place was a hotbed of trades union activity.
He does tell a story well, doesn't he? Local historian photographer Bob Caddick telling us all about what went on in Ringstead.
Bernie Keith.